All right, I wanted to take a hopefully quick, brief, somewhat short look at approval actions in Power Automate. Now, this is not going to be everything you ever want to know about approval actions, but I wanted to cover sort of the difference between the original approvals and what are now modern approvals. And the main reason I want to talk about that is that the originals, if you start any of your flows from a template that includes an approval action, and if that template was created prior to spring of 2018, which a lot of them were, then it'll be using the classic approval template or the classic started approval action. And the modern approval actions that were introduced in the spring of 2018, there's a fundamental difference in how the responses are stored or structured that you really need to kind of see to understand to know how to address them and how to work with the data that's coming out of that approval process. So first, let's take a look at, this is the using basically the integrated OneDrive for Business request sign-off flow. So if you go into your OneDrive for Business and go to the Automate menu and select Request Sign-Off, it will generate this flow for you called Request Sign-Off, but it is an older template, so it is still using the classic Start and Approval, and it's important to note the name is Start and Approval, and that's it, just those three words, action. And this is a fine way to do approvals. It was for, prior to the spring of 2018, it was the only option that we had really for a coordinated approval process, and it worked well. There were some shortcomings. For example, there was no way to really, when you start that approval, your flow is in a holding pattern. It waits for the approval to complete before anything else can happen. So you don't have the ability to, say, send an email reminder to the approver, or send a, basically have it time out. If they don't respond after a certain point in time, you want to take some sort of default action, like reject it by default, or escalate it to someone else. You couldn't easily do that using the classic approval action. So that's one of the reasons that when they updated approvals in early 2018, they kind of broke that one action up. And just to be clear, this was the only action that was available in that approvals connector prior to the spring of 2018. When they made that update to Power Automate in, as I said, somewhere around April 2018, they introduced essentially three new actions. They took that one original action, and essentially the direct replacement for that is now called Start and Wait for an Approval. To be clear, this is, again, functionally the same as that original, where once it's started, the rest of the flow, and anything that's not in a parallel branch, so anything occurring below that Start and Wait for an Approval action, is not going to fire. It's not going to be triggered or run until that approval is complete. So if this is an approval where you've got 5 people and you're requiring that all of them approve, it's not going to, nothing is going to proceed. The flow will just sit there and wait for all 5 people to respond, or it will time out after 30 days. Now, the other two actions, create an approval and wait for an approval, were designed to give you a little more modularity, or a little more flexibility. So essentially what you can do is use the create an approval action to just generate the approval. Now this still sends the email as the other one does, but after it sends that email, whatever you define, whatever actions you add below that action, that create an approval action, will run as normal. So essentially you can create that approval and then do something else. For example, you could have a loop here that waits 3 days and sends an approval or sends a reminder. And what's really nice is that one of the outputs of this create an approval action is what they call a response link. So it's a direct link to that approval action. Again, prior to this, prior to the introduction of this particular action, if you wanted to send someone a reminder manually, you would have to essentially tell them, okay, go to this site, click here, click on this approval, then make a choice. So this approval response link essentially gives you a shortcut to point them directly to the place they need to go to make that choice or make that decision. And then obviously at some point below that, create an approval action. You do need a wait for an approval action, which is sort of the other end. Think of these as bookends. This creates the approval. This sits and waits for that approval to finish. So whatever else you want to do in between, if you want to send reminders, just as a recommendation, what you really need to do is have this wait for an approval, and whatever process you're using to send a reminder or take some default action or escalate it, whatever you're going to do, those need to be running as parallel branches to this wait for an approval. Because if you have a reminder here and the reminder is set to wait 10 days and they approve it within 1 day, then it's going to wait 10 days for that step to finish. So in other words, you would want to add a parallel branch in here, and this is where you would define your send reminder action. I'll just cancel out of that for right now. So that's the basic difference in the options that we have for creating approvals. Now the other difference, comparing the original or the classic approvals with the modern approvals, is how the responses are structured. So if I go over to, this is again that classic one, I'm just going to look at one of the runs of this. When we look at the run history for the flow, we can look at that approval and see what the outputs were, so that we can see this start an approval action had a singular response of approve. So that tells us what essentially the person who responded, they selected approve. And then within that we have a responses array, because if this were something that where the approval was sent to 5 people, then you would have 5 responses. Even when it's only sent to one person, this is still structured as an array. We know it's an array because we have an opening square bracket, we have an opening curly brace, etc. And then within that responses, we have the responder, the ID, the display name, all that good stuff. We have the approval response, we have comments, we have a responder array to tell us who actually responded to this. We have the response date, and we have a singular value for comments. Now this is important because you typically want to include those comments when you are sending the requester an email to say this was approved or this was rejected. Typically when someone is approving or rejecting, they're going to include why. Especially if they're rejecting it, they should include some indication of why they're rejecting it in those comments. So you want to include that in your email to the requester. And in the classic approvals, because comments is a singular field, that's easy to do. Now there is technically a comments under responses, but there is a singular comments field that you can, and the main difference is, again, because that comments field under the responses array is going to be treated as an array value, the comments, the singular comments field, is treated as a string. So we can very easily add that into an email message, for example. Now in the newer approvals, again, if I look at the run history of one of this particular flow, and I look at the outcome of the start and wait for an approval, as well as the wait for an approval, so these should be largely the same. The main difference is that all of the responses here, so instead of having just that response, a singular response value, it's all contained in this array called responses. So we have comments is inside of that. We have further down outside of that array, we do have an outcome. So again, when we're evaluating this using a condition to say what was the outcome of that approval action, we want to use that outcome value, or we want to evaluate that outcome value to say, is the outcome approve? Yes, do this. No, do that. But the kind of the significant thing here is that we do have a response summary, but that doesn't include the comments. It includes the approver, it includes their email, it includes the response, and the date. And maybe that's all you want, maybe that's all you need. But more often than not, you want to include that comments. Now, the fact that the only comments we have are inside of this responses array means we need to handle it a little bit differently. So there's a pretty standard pattern that I personally use whenever I have something that is an array that I want to present as a string. So in this case, the comments the comments from the approver are stored as or presented as an array, and I want to get that in the form of a string that I can put into an email. So there are a handful of different ways to do this. This is just what I found to work best for me. But I'm not going to say that the other solutions you find won't work as well. So essentially what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into edit mode. Before this parallel branch, or actually I could do it here as well, and I'll add an action to create a variable. So I'm going to initialize a variable, and I'll call this var comments 2, because this will be the second one, and actually I'm going to go over here and I'll call this var comments 3, just to stick with the naming of my actions there. Oh, I forgot to make that a string. So make sure that it is you're initializing a variable. Call it whatever you want, just make sure that it's something you're going to remember. So this one I'm calling comments 2, this I'm calling comments 3. Make sure that it is a string variable and leave the initial value as blank. So now what we're going to do is, after the completion of the approval, I'm going to add an action here, and we're going to append. And again, this is not strictly for this purpose. This is just one of the many cases where I've used this pattern. So I'm going to append to a string variable, and I'm going to select that string variable, var comments 2. And in this case, what I'm going to do is append the responses comments, which is right here, responses comments. And you'll notice that what that does is it forces it into an apply to each loop, which is fine. But in this scenario where this is a single, essentially an approval sent to a single person, single approver, you're only going to have one value, which means that this is just going to take that one value and stick it from that array into this string variable, and you're good to go. If there were a case of multiple approvers, so let's say you had 3 or 4 people lined up here, and you wanted to get the comments from all the approvers, essentially what you would want to do is probably attribute them. So you would say approver, and then put in the approvals, or I'm sorry, the responses, approver name, and then have comments, and then make sure you put in a line break there. So essentially, if you have 5 approvers, what you're going to end up with is, when this loop is done running, it's going to have compiled the approver, first approver's name and their comments, the second approver's name and their comments, the third approver's name and their comments, so on and so forth. You get the idea. But the bottom line is that this is going to, whether it's one approval, one approver, or 5 or 10, this is going to do the job. Just understand that this is not going to run until all of those approvers, or until the approval condition has been satisfied. So in this case, first to respond means it's only going to wait for one response. If I were to set it to everyone must approve or wait for all responses, essentially it means it's going to wait for every single, if this is assigned to 10 people, it's going to wait for all 10 of them to respond. Anyway, back to what we were talking about. So this is the apply to each loop, where we're just building that comments, so that then later down here I can say, if in this condition, if it's approved, if the outcome is approved, then yes, I want to, actually let me just, I'll just put in the comments here. So we'll just add in the dynamic comments, or dynamic content, var comments 2, and there we go. Now, in the case of the split, where we're creating the approval and waiting for it, same exact pattern works. It's just, you want to be sure that you build those comments after the wait for an approval action, because until then you don't have the comments. So again, we'll add an action here, and I will again append to that string variable. This time we'll select comments 3, and in this case we're going to select responses comments, and there we go. And again, same idea. If we, in this case, this approval was assigned to just one person. If it was assigned to multiples, then you might want to incorporate in here, as you're building the comments value, or the comments string, make sure that you indicate which approver made which comments. I'll skip that for the sake of time here. But then the same thing down here, we have our condition, if the outcome is equal to approve, and I'll just grab all of that, and we'll just drop in in this case, var comments 3. So now when this approval runs, essentially, if the we're going to take that the array of comments, concatenate them together, or append them together into a single responses, or comments variable rather, and then we can use that variable to plug into our notification email. So it makes things a little bit cleaner. The other option, just to show you what would happen if we were to not take this step, and you may already know this, but we'll just say send me a notification, and in this case I'm going to say approved, and in the body I'm going to go down to wait for an approval, and in this case I'm going to select responses comments. And basically what happens in that scenario is it's going to putting that send email notification action inside of that apply to each loop. So again, in the case of a single approver, this isn't really a problem. But if you have a case of 2 approvers or 3 approvers or 5 approvers, that means that for every one of those approvers, the requester is going to get a separate email. So this email will have, the first one will have the first approver's comments, the second will have the second, etc. So again, depending on your scenario, if it's a single approver scenario, then you can do it this way. But I tend to prefer to build things in a more durable way, so that down the road, if someone says, well, we wanted that was originally a single approver, but now we need to have 3 approvers, I don't want to have to go back and rebuild the flow in a different way. If I can get away with just going back and updating what's put into that variable to attribute the comments to specific approvers, then that's a lot easier than rebuilding an approval action or rebuilding the entire flow. So again, use this if you'd like. If you have found another way to compile those comments, then certainly you can do that as well. But that's just a couple of ways that I found to deal with the approval comments, and not quite as quick as I would like, look at the difference between the classic approval scenarios and actions and the modern approval actions. I will say, if you are building from scratch, the only actions you are able to use now are the new create an approval or start and wait for an approval, as well as the wait for an approval. So if you're building from scratch, those are the only choices you have. But bear in mind, if you are using an older template, you might still see the old version of the start and approval action.